Have you got to the point now where you feel like we won a silver and didn't lose a gold?
Yeah, I have. I've got there. I mean, it's probably was easier because we didn't have a great Mel and Brandie didn't have a great start to the games. We ended up finishing third in our pool, which was we were the number one seed in our pool. We expected to win our pool. So I think there was a component of, appreciation that our tournament didn't end sooner. We had to go through a lucky loser, round of 16, quarterfinals. And so I think because of that, I think there's also, it's easier to accept that, hey, a silver medal is still pretty darn good. It probably took about 72 hours before I got to that point, though. And mainly I'm just sad for them. We had a big lead in the first set against Brazil. If we replayed that set over again with that lead, we would win it 9 times out of 10, and then we dominated the second set and won that one comfortably. And then, Brazil played a great third, and we lost that one. But still super proud, and I'm there now.
For this episode of Energy Untold, it was great to sit down with Kerry MacDonald, high performance leader at Volleyball Canada. Kerry's got a master's in coaching and a PhD in sports injury epidemiology. It was great to sit down with Kerry and discuss the Paris Olympics, the future of the sport in Canada, and just catch up. I hope you enjoy this conversation with Kerry MacDonald.
There's kind of like one company out of New York called Ball Time.
Okay.
And they're invested by a bunch of like professional volleyball players. And they're finally like getting it done, like using AI, just like.
Isn't it still subjective to code a match?
Yeah, so they're not doing a great job on like the subjective evaluation of performance. What they're able to do now is like player number 7 hit the ball, they set the ball, they pass the ball, they serve the ball.
Okay.
So they're at least being able to tag the matches.
Yeah.
And so then you can identify all of the skills. So you can pull up, I want to say every time number 7 did this. Whatever. So you
just spiked, or just
spiked the
passed.
Ball, whatever, just pass.
So they're not necessarily evaluating this is a good pass or an average pass.
I don't believe so. Like we'll get the demo tomorrow. From what I've seen so far, it's more just like match tagging, and then we're still someone's got to go in and code it, and like provide the subjective evaluation.
Yeah.
I mean, some things are quite objective, like the ball hit the floor, it didn't hit the floor,
Yeah.
or it was out, or what have you. But pass quality, anything that's like quality related, still requires that human input at this point.
Is there what is the standard now for quality? Like how do you describe the quality of a pass now?
I would say
is it universal worldwide, or no, not yet?
There's kind of 2 systems, I would almost say. Like North America, we like to do this like 3-point pass scale.
So that's the same.
That's kind of the same. Like Canada, US, we use that a lot.
Still.
And some people incorporate like a 4th quality that's like perfect is like 4.
Yeah.
But if you go to more like international volleyball and over in Europe or what have you, they all use data volley. And data volley has keystrokes that are like exclamative and hashtag and slash and all these things. And basically it's like a 5-point scale.
Okay.
But they call it based on the keystroke that you actually push when you're using data volley. So exclamative exclamation mark as an example. So it's funny how it's like the language they use on pass quality is actually completely linked to the keystroke that you use in data volley when you're tagging the game.
Yeah. So like a 5 pass for them is not only, it'd be I guess it'd be 4 options.
Yes, exactly.
Plus like whatever the setter could dump it or like do whatever.
Exactly. And their system, like we tend to be very like area specific with like our zones. And what they do a better job of is they actually look at like the height matters as well. You might pass it in the
tempo,
perfect zone,
but
if it's a rifle right at the setter's head, like they don't have time to make all their options. So that's a different pass quality.
Yeah.
Whereas we tend to just be like, it was in that zone, so we give the score sort of idea. So there's still a lot of subjective evaluation.
Are any teams like intentionally trying to pass it more towards position 3 as opposed to between 2 and 3, or
not
like
really.
In certain scenarios? No, you're like.
Not so, not too much. They're kind of like that standard spot is still the piece. The one thing that they are trying to do specifically in like transition situations, like if they get a really good slowdown on the block, is they try and pass it faster to the setter and transition with speed. so that the other team who just attacked has to set up their block and maybe won't be fully formed
Right.
and won't be able to
And
make
so
as many
faster
reads.
than you would in serve receive.
Faster than they would in serve receive. Yeah. So like they're actually trying to run like a quick pass in. Like you'll see France specifically, they'll do that a little bit.
Well,
if they get a
actually,
good
that makes
opportunity.
sense, right? Because it's a much easier ball.
It's easier for the setter to set, and that's the other thing on serve receive is that if you don't insist on having this really high, nice, perfectly arched pass,
Yeah.
you actually make it lower. It's actually easier to be more accurate,
Mm.
right? So you can improve accuracy with a lower pass trajectory,
Yeah.
as well. So that's another kind of like factor to it.
Yeah.
And like Graham's, I know working with the Calgary guys on this right now is like, just keep it low and you can just kind of shovel it to the setter. Don't worry about this like absolutely perfect parabola that we're trying to make and predict that, okay, I got to pass the ball up to there so that it's going to land there.
Yeah, to be in and around the tape is more challenging.
It's more challenging, yeah.
And then what about setting? Like what is the classification of like perfect set versus okay set?
That's really, really hard. Like I would say for the most part, like unless the hitter completely messes it up, they're just going to say it's a good set. Like unless the hitter's like, oh, the hitter can't make that, or if it were maybe on video they'll see that it fell way inside and that shouldn't have been.
So that actually hasn't been
inside.
quantified yet.
It's sometimes some teams will have their own custom tags that they'll kind of like add in, but I wouldn't say it's a standardized system by any means on the setter tags, from what I know. Yeah.
Yeah, because you'd still want to be able to evaluate whether a setter had a good game or not.
Yeah.
And then right now it's like pretty subjective, right?
That's one of the hardest things to evaluate is the strength of a setter because you don't have this like perfect case controls type of situation. Like the only way to really do it is like if you got two setters and you literally just flip them and keep everything else the same against the same opponent in the same situation.
And just see what happens.
And see what happens. But like that doesn't occur. So what ends up happening is like, how do you evaluate this? Like it's so subjective. Like objectifying setting in volleyball is it's very, very difficult to do.
Have you seen any of those clips from that Greg Maddox documentary that's come out? Were you a baseball fan at all?
I was, but I haven't seen it.
Okay, you should check this out.
Okay.
So like he does a bunch of interesting things as you can imagine, right? Because he was like kind of the same quality of pitcher, probably like arm speed and everything, maybe a little bit like or pretty average, right? You could throw in the low 90s, but nothing crazy. Yeah. But then he was just like kind of next level control and then tactics. Yeah. So there's like this one story about like I think it was like Jeff Baggio, like specifically like giving him a pitch that he could hit on a home run on, like in the middle of the regular season when they were down, when the Braves were already up like 8-0 or something like that. Right. Just so that he could, so Baggio would remember that pitch,
set him up
for the playoffs kind of thing because they knew they were going to play the Astros. But the other thing that came up was he was calling the games, not the catcher.
Oh,
and
really?
so they
calling pitches.
He was calling pitches.
Oh, wow!
And he had this elaborate set of signals and hand signals where he would tell the catcher what was going to happen next.
Oh, that's crazy.
But it made me think of like obviously setting the setter controls the game and calls the game. But have you seen a scenario where that's actually not the case?
You'll see some scenarios where they'll kind of like audible things. So mainly in like the transition of the play, where
a hitter might
they'll audible something. Like specifically middles will do it.
Yeah.
You know, like in transition based on where this passes, I'm going here and they'll kind of say like 60-60 or push this or whatever inside here.
But not necessarily I see something that maybe you don't and like give me the ball.
They might on the like there might be the odd one like, hey, like let's lay one inside. Let's set this one a little bit inside on this one play. The blocker's really drifting out wide on me or something. Like they may have like in between points kind of like let's do this sort of idea, but it's not very much. There's not a lot going on there. But that aspect of sport, I think, like that game theory side of it of how do you set it up, I think is such a fascinating piece. Like not only with setters, but like more into my current context in beach volleyball is okay, so the last, like you think of it, you're serving one or two players, and for the most part, most teams pick on one player, right? And so that player, the last time I served them, they passed the ball here, they did this. This time I served them, they passed the ball same spot and they did that. Yeah. And it's like, how can we figure out what they're going to do next? And vice versa, as an attacker, it's like, okay, last time I hit the ball down the line, are they going to run to the line on this one? do I need to try and go cross court, or can I keep going to the line on this? And how can I trying to make that understanding this player likes to hold their defensive structure longer, or this one's very chasey and they'll chase whatever the last shot was, and understanding the behavioral kind of approaches that the opposition has is actually a really, really key piece of being successful.
Is there enough points where you can basically throw away some, or not necessarily throw away some, just to get information? Or I guess in like a 3-set best of 3, there's not enough time. You actually need to treat every single point like you need to win it.
Yeah. I don't think there's a whole lot of like trying to set that up or something. Yeah, I think there, like for the most part, it still comes down to as well, when you get late in matches, players tend to do what they're most comfortable doing. So they revert back to their comfort zone, which is going to be the shot that they've made the most often. They're probably going to do that one more often. Yeah. And so what you try to do more so is you try and train and save some stuff maybe. It's like, hey, I haven't used this shot a lot. They're not going to be expecting this. I got this in my bag. Okay, I'm going to try and use it in this moment. Like there's maybe a bit of that sort of gamesmanship happening. But there's not a lot of like, hey, I'm just going to duff this one away and let them have it kind of idea.
Right.
So, yeah.
So kind of going back, what was it that inspired you to like kind of pursue a career in volleyball in the first place? Can you pinpoint a moment or?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I initially just wanted to be a phys ed teacher because in school I just loved going to gym class. Like I just loved walking in the gym, and I would come from whatever science or math or whatever it was I was doing, and I would just walk into a gym and I'd just be super happy to be in a gym and being physically active, and so I loved that. And then I looked at what my phys ed teachers were doing, and I grew up in Revelstoke, BC, a little small ski mountain town, and we had block systems. We had 2.5-hour blocks. So I had a 2.5-hour phys ed block every day.
Or
every other day. So in our phys ed block, we would go like canoeing and skiing and mountain biking and cross country skiing, and we would have 2.5 hours of like a sport. We'd do skills and tournaments and like really get immersed in it. And I just thought, I'm like, they get to do this every block, these teachers. And I'm like, this is amazing. I just want to do this. So my initial piece was I really wanted to just be a phys ed teacher, and then I had a really good mentor. And a guy named John Campbell, who was a volleyball coach in Revelstoke, and he got me into playing volleyball when I was in grade 8. And he had won 7 consecutive high school provincial championships through the 70s and 80s with Revelstoke, which was obviously a really small town to be able to do anything. And it was what he did was he ran practices 5 days a week. From 7 a.m. to 8:30 when school started. And it was like open gym. Whoever wanted to come. And it was just like basic technique, type of pieces. So, and I just loved it. So I would get up at 7 a.m. I'm not a morning person, but I'm like, I'm going to go to this. So I would just walk, thankfully lived close to school. I'd walk up to the school every morning, 7 a.m. and just getting basic fundamental reps.
He just made it open to whoever
wanted to come.
Wanted to set their alarm.
And we were grade 8 to 12. Like, like it was a big age spread. And all it was everyone's in fundamentals. And I could be partnered up with a grade 12 and we're just forearm passing, playing pep or whatever. And he kind of had like a pretty consistent practice of how it went. And eventually we'd get into some gameplay and we had 2 courts and would divide by age a bit. But that was just kind of like our fundamental session. And then after school, you still had your team. So you had grade 8 boys or whatever. This was just like extra reps sort of idea. And with lots of kids that would come and do it. And I actually got to go and do it when I was I was still in elementary school. And I was in grade 7. And he saw me like playing with a volleyball in a park with a buddy, and he was biking through the park. And he's like, "Hey, you guys should come next week." So my grade 7 year, I got to go to the high school, which was a big deal, and like go in at 7 in the morning and get extra reps with these high school kids. And then I'd go get on my bike and I'd bike over to my elementary school. And so I developed definitely like a passion for volleyball at that time. And this passion for phys ed, and that led me to the University of Calgary to kinesiology and doing kines there. And I wasn't good enough to play volleyball at the U of C. But I knew the Volley Dome was across the street. I'd been to volleyball tournaments there. So my first week on campus, I just walked across from Res to the Volley Dome. When I walked in the door, And I'm like, hey, is there like a men's league team that I could like try and get on?
Yeah.
And I didn't know who I was talking to, but it was Don Saxon, an Olympic legend in our sport of volleyball. And he's like, yeah, you got to have to sign up as a whole team. We don't really have like individual spots.
Yeah.
But I have a U14 boys team that needs a coach. And I'm like, do you want to coach it? I'm like, I've never really coached, but I'm like, I could help out, sure. And next thing I know, I was signed up to coach a club team, and I was coaching club volleyball.
The head coach too.
I was the head coach, and I was 18 years old, and that's where. And then also Calgary was the home for the Olympic team for Canada for a long time through like the 80s and 90s.
Mm-hmm.
And I was just fortunate that when I was getting into coaching, it was all of their kids were now getting into volleyball.
Yeah.
And so little did I know that I'm just coaching Olympians' kids in volleyball.
Yeah.
And so we had a lot of success and won provincial championships. And I just won the genetic lottery of teams in a lot of ways. And so and that's the other piece. So when you start having success at something, you're like, oh, I think I'm okay at this.
But you also did well enough that the Olympians didn't say to Don, hey, you got to get this guy.
You got to get rid of this guy. Yeah, I was good enough to kind of hang in there. And I had great mentorship from Olympians and their parents and, that were around. And it was just, that was kind of my like foray into volleyball.
So you're doing this throughout your undergrad.
Yeah.
And then you still end up coaching more after that, right?
Yeah. So then I I coached through kind of club through my undergrad, and then I was just finishing up my undergrad, and the University of Calgary had a coaching change, and Rod Durant was hired, and I basically went to him and said, hey, I'm willing to like volunteer assistant coach, whatever you need, and so he allowed me to kind of enter into his gym. So then that started my coaching at a university level. Started off quite part-time. Eventually that kind of grew. And then I also started working after my undergrad with Volleyball Alberta, kind of as a program coordinator and working in that space. Kept coaching club, coaching university. I was coaching high school teams, just like kind of continually doing it, coaching almost year round.
Yeah.
Through that, did my master's degree at Victoria in coaching.
And so by this time you already have kind of decided that you don't want to be a phys ed teacher.
Yeah. So to back up a bit, I guess I was in my last year, I think, of my undergrad, and I was doing phys ed, and I had a teaching practicum, and I'm out at these teaching practicums, and these kids are walking into the gym, and I don't know, in my head, I just expected these kids to walk in the gym with the same excitement I always had walking into the gym.
Yeah.
And these kids are just like dragging their feet coming into the gym, being like, I don't want to be here. I hate this. And I'm like, oh, right, when you're a phys ed teacher, you don't just get to work with athletes and people that love phys ed.
Yeah.
Like, you have to motivate some kids to be here. And I'm just like, oh, I don't think I can do that. I'm like, with coaching, every kid shows up to practice. They want to be, like, for the most part, they want to be there.
Yeah.
And so I'm just like, I think this coaching thing seems a little bit better. So that's kind of like diverted me away. And then I'm like, I got to find a way to make a career in coaching. Yeah. And all I knew to do, and I got some good advice, was like get into as many gyms as you can, work with as many coaches as you can. Yeah. I took that really seriously and took that to heart. And I did that. And I was really hoping, truthfully, for like a college or a university job to kind of open up. Right. But from when I started coaching at the university level in 2007 up until 2013, there really wasn't a job opening that opened up. The coaches that were working in Canada West, I didn't really want to leave Western Canada. There was no openings for me. So,
well, one, there's not that many jobs. And then two, really at that point, you stayed for a while.
Yeah, exactly. And if you get in with a university situation, it's a pretty gravy situation. So, so what I ended up doing in 2013, I was kind of like, you know what, I don't think this coaching career, I don't think there's enough opportunity for me. Yeah. And I was coaching a kid on a club team, and his dad was a professor at the University of Calgary, and he was running the Injury Prevention Research Center at the U of C. And we were having a meal at a tournament somewhere, and he was saying how, you know that the coach has a major role in preventing injuries in volleyball. And I was thinking about that, and I'm like, like how so? And he was talking about like training load, and I was trying to understand even what training load was at the time. And so we started getting into
it. Who was this?
This was Dr. Winame Wissa.
Right.
He's the medical director for the NHL now. And Yeah,
And he's been in that role for a while, right?
He's been in that role for quite a while. Yeah, he stepped away from kind of the academic world probably 4 or 5 years ago fully and stepped away from the University of Calgary and is now just with the NHL.
Yeah.
So I was really fortunate. He just happened to be a dad of a kid I was coaching.
Yeah.
And he convinced me that I should come back to academia and I should do a PhD and I should look specifically at the role that the coach plays in preventing injury and start to investigate this whole idea of load management. And this is before Gary Leonard and load management was really a thing. And so that's
Was it actually called load management at that time too, or what did you call it?
No, so it was this idea. There wasn't really anything. There was training load was kind of what was being kind of like the terminology of training load was what was being thrown around.
Yeah.
There was a little bit of work. A couple researchers out there, a guy named Tim Gabbett, actually 2 researchers out of Australia. Tim Gabbett was probably the most predominant one at the time, and he was doing some work on this idea of training load. And the idea of like, how we fluctuate high and low and what seems to be the best from an injury prevention perspective.
Was he doing it from a team sport perspective or just kind of any?
Yeah, he was doing it. Actually, a lot of his stuff was coming from cricket, and they were looking at fast bowlers in cricket and how many bowls they were doing.
So pitch count.
Pitch count, basically, from baseball. And then his second one was he was using rugby players. And rugby in Australia, I think it was predominantly in Australia, had been using this what's called RPE, so rating of perceived exertion. And so he had these data sets of rating of perceived exertion of how hard practice was. And so he went through and was analyzing this data from rugby and from fast bowlers in cricket and kind of started to determine this idea of like acute load and chronic load.
Yeah.
And acute being kind of how much work you did over 1 week, so how much you kind of shocked the system.
Yeah.
Chronic load being how much you've done over the previous month.
Yeah.
And looking at that as being a measure of your fitness.
Yeah.
How much can you handle?
Yeah.
And so trying to create a situation where your acute load doesn't vary too much from your chronic load.
Yeah.
And that being potentially protective from an injury perspective.
So I guess it's not just injury prevention, but also capacity building. Right? So
yeah, and that's the big piece with all of this is it's trying to build the engine and build the machine big enough to be able to withstand the peak demands that you're going to ask it to do.
Of that particular sport.
And down to even like the specific tissue that you're worrying about.
So was this all Dr. Mayowis's idea, or you guys were collaborating on this and kind of spitballing back and forth and then refined what the work would actually look like?
Yeah, like what we were looking at, and in particular dealing with in boys volleyball, was jumper's knee. Or patellar tendinopathy. And so we were saying it's so predominant. Like we're talking 80% of any boy playing volleyball at a university level probably has or has had for sure jumper's knee.
Yeah.
And so we were looking—
if you can jump high enough.
If you can jump high enough. Yeah, exactly. So we were looking at that and kind of saying, well, that's just like anything that's tendon related, an injury to a tendon like that that's chronic in nature is potentially just mismanagement of load.
Yeah.
And if we just get load right, we could potentially eliminate that.
Yeah.
And that was kind of the theory behind it. But he was a doctor and seeing this clinically, but didn't have the ability to be like, hey, coaches, let's change the load and or really an understanding of like, how do we change the load? What does that look like that would actually result in a healthier knee tendon in a jumping sport?
So what was the protocol that you designed?
Yes. Well, the first thing we had to do is we had to collect a whole lot of data.
Right.
And it's funny how like I launched into this thinking like, oh, it's going to be amazing. We're going to come up with this protocol and we're going to roll this out and we're going to do a randomized controlled trial with all these teams. And then like we start off with like, well, what is an injury? How do we measure an injury? And specifically, it's really easy in an acute setting where it's like, I got hit in the head, I have a concussion, there's a diagnosis. But with something like a tendinopathy or anything that's
but you
chronic,
can still play.
You can still play, and it's like, so how bad is it? And it's a sliding scale and the subjective component. So the first thing we had to do was try and figure out how are we going to quantify patellar tendinopathy and severity of patellar tendinopathy. And fortunately, there was a group out of Norway that was working on this, and we were able to tie into some of that. And then the second thing we had to figure out is how do we quantify load? What are we going to do? And so it turned out there was an accelerometer company that had just come on the market. So we had to go and validate that and figure out like, okay, can this accurately measure it? And then we went and—
So you're measuring number of jumps, but then also jump height, or—
Number of jumps, jump height were the two big ones at the time. They've since gone on to like landing impacts and some other metrics that are of interest for sure. And then we're measuring injury and severity of injury.
Yeah.
And and then we also did a whole lot of stuff because we were trying to determine one of the big things in injury prevention was actually at the time was looking at trying to screen athletes to determine who was more predisposed, in a preseason environment, and could we intervene there? Like this person has these qualities, which means that they have a much higher likelihood of developing this injury, this chronic injury. So
too much training too fast, for example, or
it could be something like just like more like mobility or strength related, or like range of motion or what have you, or like the landing mechanics, like how do they land? So the first thing we did was actually try and look at that. So we tried to look at a whole bunch of baseline screens. And so we screened about 80 athletes over a baseline of the beginning of the year. And then we followed them over the course of an entire season. And we measured all of their jumps with the accelerometer. We measured their pain scores. I did that for the entire year. And we then looked at that and we're like, okay, so from this, we should have this beautiful way of like, oh, these athletes didn't get injured, these did.
Yeah.
So they had these preseason things plus these load things. And the reality is that it's way more complicated than that.
Just all messy, yeah.
It's so messy. And it's funny, like you look at some of the baseline stuff, you look at like really good versus really bad landing technique, and you try and like, okay, so which ones got injured? Well, it's about half of both. And it's like, so it's not just landing technique. It's like, and so it's this multifactorial dynamic environment that we're dealing with. And another PhD student ended up coming in and wrote a beautiful paper kind of about just how messy and ugly this space is of trying to predict injury in sport.
So now how do you apply those learnings in the setting of coaching?
Yeah,
because I'm guessing you don't ignore them. You apply them and design a protocol and periodization and
and so there's a couple of things that really did pop out from the work we did was that the highest rate of knee pain was in the first month of the season, so right as I started, and it was right after the Christmas break. Almost everyone had a break at Christmas, and then they started after Christmas break. And those were the peaks of pain were the highest across every single team. And so what we said, well, what's the commonality there? And the commonality is that they're coming off of low training load, and then most teams start up and they go like double days. It's like we gotta hit the ground running. We gotta so they go really hard right away. And so we see the greatest increase in training load, and we saw the greatest increase in pain. So there's definitely something about how we adapt the training volumes and being very methodical and gradual with how we try and do that. And then the other piece was that, but once we kind of got up to training volumes and fairly high peaks of training volumes, we actually saw eventually the pain just kind of dropped off. As they've developed capacity. And now they could handle it. And so this idea of actually getting to some higher training volumes seems to be protective from an injury perspective.
Right.
But it's how we get there.
The path to get there.
It's the path to get there that really matters. So I was fortunate when I finished my PhD, I was just wrapping it up, and the job at University of British Columbia became available. And so I went out to Vancouver, and I was the head coach of the men's volleyball team there. And that's what I was able to implement. So we were able to say, okay, let's be real methodical with how we build our training volumes. And then let's try and get to some high loads. Let's try and maintain these high loads and try and keep them healthy. And we're really over the 2 seasons there. We didn't have a single day loss due to a chronic injury over those 2 years. We stayed really, really healthy. And the other one that was really big was every athlete personal bested their jump height in the last week before going to national championships. So we were able to not only keep them healthy, but we were also performing.
Peaking at the exact right time.
We're peaking at the exact right time. So we were getting stronger as we went through the year. And that was a lot of work our strength and conditioning team did out there and working with them, with myself on court and them in the weight room and how we periodized and tapered appropriately. But but it was really kind of positive to see that.
And so even getting that job in the first place was probably a bit of a surprise, right? Because you went and did your PhD work thinking you were going in a different path. And then actually, oh no, this job came up. I think it was a bit of a surprise to the community that you got it because you were not that experienced. But how did you get the job?
It's a good.
Or do you still not know?
It's a good question. I truthfully applied I submitted my resume at 11:59 p.m. and the job closed at midnight. Like I had it sitting in the inbox being like, do I want to do this? I was looking at a postdoc opportunity with the MBA actually, which was a pretty cool opportunity. And then I had other postdoc opportunities to stay here in Calgary and within the clinic or within the lab I was in.
Yeah.
And I was kind of thinking I was going to go the academia route
Yeah.
and kind of stay in that realm. And it was kind of one of two jobs I would have probably even applied. There's only two I probably would have applied for. It was like, I love Vancouver and I'm from BC and I was excited about that. Or it was stay here in Calgary and it was University of Calgary. Like I kind of didn't care about anything else that was going to open. And that one came about. I'm like, fine, I'll throw my name in the hat. I won't get it.
Yeah.
I know 3, 4, 5 other applicants that have been coaching at college for decades, have been coaching university teams and been very successful.
Yeah.
Like this isn't something I'm probably at the level for.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't know fully why they hired me. I think the PhD piece was attractive to them. I think they were, at the time, one of the associate athletic directors was really, really keen on the sports science side and was really trying to grow the sports science within the department at UBC. So I think that was a real added bonus for me. And I was fortunate that a lot of the, former national team alumni that were here in Calgary that knew me were willing to be references and even officially or even unofficially. I know they phoned different people in Calgary as well and were like, hey, this Kerry kid, is he any good? And and I don't know, somehow I fell into that.
Got it.
Yeah.
And then was it in your second year that you guys won?
Yeah, second year.
So it was pretty quick.
It was pretty quick. Yeah, our first year we made it back to nationals, which was kind of the goal. We finished 4th there. So it was great. It was great to get back there and great to get that experience. And then, and then we were fortunate in our second year we were able to win the national championships.
And then aside from kind of the load management stuff, what were some of the other, tactics and strategies that you were putting in place at that time that were differentiated from the rest of Canada West? Because you were obviously doing something right that somebody else, like the rest of the teams, weren't doing.
Yeah, I mean, this was such a benefit. I didn't realize that when I was going to do a PhD that it would help me in different areas. Like I thought it was going to help me with like load management and preventing injuries, and it certainly did. But the other piece that happened by doing a PhD and doing multiple courses in biostatistics, as an example, was I just got better. I got decent at playing with numbers and data sets and analyzing data sets. So my first year at UBC, and then actually, let me back up a second. So I had this idea of like I could manage data sets well. And then I heard a podcast with a sports psychologist who works with USA Volleyball named Andrea Becker. And she's the assistant coach for them. So she sits in the assistant coaching chair, but she's a sports psych, which is really uncommon to have that level of seniority within a coaching staff without being a volleyball coach.
How did that even come to be?
John Spraw, I think, I don't know exactly where that relationship started or ended, but I think he was working with her. I'm not sure if it was at UCLA or because he coaches at the UCLA men's volleyball team and the USA men's volleyball team. So I'm not sure in which context he was working with her, but I believe there were some components there where, she was saying and pointing things out to him from a sports psychology piece in game. And he was just like, oh my goodness, like I didn't see that. Like that's a blind spot for me. And I think he saw that, it'd be a tremendous benefit to have that insight, on the bench with us in the heat of battle and in the heat of competition. Whereas most part, we put mental performance coaches in the stand somewhere, and we have athletes go and see them one-on-one, but
in between or after the fact
or whatever, But I think he looked at like, let's try and really incorporate this into what we are doing. But one of the things that she said on her podcast was she was talking about the psychology of serving in volleyball. And you can equate this to kind of any serving skill or pitching or what have you. And what she was saying is that if we try and really focus on just that skill itself, if we ask the athlete to have tons of variability in how they perform, then that's going to create an increased level of potential stress. Whereas if we ask them just to do one thing and do it really, really well and do it over and over and over again, there's a level of comfort to that. And then the second piece was that if we focus on if we have them focusing on the error side or trying to prevent the error, we know from a psychological perspective, they're likely going to make more errors. But if we put a lot of pressure and stress on like, you can't make mistakes, you can't make errors, chances are they're not going to perform optimally. So what we need to do is we need to devalue.
That can manifest in a team setting in a number of ways, right? Like the coach can set the culture or the precedent in a way where, oh, that guy missed a serve, everybody's deflated, and it can just change the entire attitude of the team.
Completely.
So,
yeah,
right.
Completely. So
and that's just like one aspect of it.
Yeah. And so her big thing was exactly that. She's like, we need to change the mental thought process and view and kind of culture around serving.
Okay.
And that service errors are a component of serving.
Yeah.
And if you want to serve really, really well, you're going to have to make errors. Yeah. And the example like I used to use—
because it's a risk-reward action.
Exactly. And if we think of it like, I often will talk to servers where like, if you're serving a ball over the net, that's what we're trying to do, serve the ball over the net. And we pick a target that where we want that ball to cross the net. Mm-hmm. And that target is, let's say it's 1 or 2 feet above the tape or something like that. Mm-hmm. If the reality is, if we want to hit that spot, we are going to randomly miss high just as often as we're going to randomly miss low, just as often as we're going to randomly left, and we're going to go right. Yeah. You know, and the one that's a little bit high might still land in. And we think that's a good serve. The one that goes a little bit low is going to hit the tape, and it's going to be, oh, we lost the point, and we're going to make a big deal out of it. Right. You know, but it's no different than if I asked you to throw a dart at a dartboard and I said, you got to hit the bullseye, but if you hit below the bullseye, you know, like the game's over. Yeah. What's going to happen is you're going to throw way above the bullseye a whole bunch of times. Right. You know, like you're just going to, you now change your—
bias your error.
You're going to bias your error high. And to do that in volleyball means you're going to have to hit the ball not as hard. You know, and so we just kind of changed the whole mentality of like, okay, if that's your target, let's just try and hit that target as many times as we can. Yeah. And if we hit it low, if we miss low, we miss low. If we miss high, we miss high. Like we're going to miss. Yeah. Let's just try and get more accurate at trying to hit that target.
The bullseye analogy is perfect. Yeah.
Yeah. And like that was our thing is we know we're going to make random error. We can't control which way we err. Mm-hmm. This is such a common coaching misconception. It's like, it's okay if you miss long, we don't miss into the net. Yeah. You don't have the luxury of doing that. Yeah. You know, if you actually want to hit that target, you're just changing your target. Yeah. In order to make that a reality.
Okay, so you remove the faux pas from errors.
Yeah, change the whole mentality around that, and then we did a lot of work on determining what is your best serve. So we incorporated radar guns. So we captured every single serve in practice. Really fortunate at UBC, was able to tie in with the kinesiology department, get some students on like practicums or whatever, sports science practicums. And so they would come to practice and they'd have a radar gun.
Was this in season 1 or season 2 that you were doing this?
Season 1.
Season 1.
We started this right off the bat.
Okay, so you already had this idea.
I had this idea that I'm like, I think serving can be hacked. Okay. And I'm like, and I'd read a book, Big Data Baseball was another one I'd read, kind of leading into that season as well, and looking at how baseball had done things like this. And really also the other one was like, where are there cultural kind of like beliefs that are really strongly held? Because that was the thing from baseball. There's all these strong cultural beliefs, and then data came in and just crushed them. Yeah. You know, and one of my ones was in serving, was around like service and servers errors, and this cultural belief that we should only miss 10% of our serves or 15% if it's this serve type. And like, there's all these like, and the other one was like, ace to error ratio. You could never have more errors than you had aces was like a real common one that was floating around. Yeah. And I'm just like, where does this come from? Yeah. You know, and I'm just like, okay, so let's just get data and let's let data drive how we serve. Yeah. And so, so we started looking at that. So we had students at practice, radar guns. They would track the serve velocity, where they're serving from, where they served the ball to, who received the ball, and the quality of the pass outcome. Yeah. And we just started collecting data. And after about a month of doing this in practice and scrimmages and whatever, we had enough data that we started to see that, hey, like your serve seems to create the worst pass outcome for the opposition, best pass outcome for us, when it's between these kind of zones, in these zones. And we're just graphing it. Yeah. And so we said, okay, that seems to be your best serve. Let's just try and train that. Let's just get really good at that one thing. You know, and then it's here, and everyone had their own individualized, customized, optimal serve for them. Yeah. And then my whole piece was like, I love if you're a server that has tons of variation, it's amazing. It's like a baseball pitcher that can, throw the changeup and the fastball and you can really play with teams. And 100% at the highest levels, that there's a lot of value to that. Yeah. But if you can just throw a 100-mile-per-hour fastball,
that also gets a lot of people.
That also gets a lot of success as well. So we had to determine, and then the other piece was that with university athletes, they are still relatively young in their development. They're not great at doing a whole bunch of things yet. Can we at least get one that's good? Yeah. And then my whole plan was like, we'll build layers down the road.
Yeah.
And by year 2, truthfully, we still weren't even building layers yet.
Yeah.
But we were the number 1 serving team in the country. We smashed all the records for the number of aces in a game. But aces actually wasn't what we were looking at statistically. It was actually just what we call one passes, or passes where the team's way off the net and the setter's running to try and get the ball.
Yeah.
That was way more advantageous, and we could do that way more often.
Yeah.
But the other one was we smashed the record on the error rates. We made way more mistakes than anybody else, and so we crushed those records as well.
Yeah.
But we were the team that was scoring the most when we served.
Right.
And that's ultimately what you have to do.
And then do you feel like it was very difficult for opponents to get into rhythm because of this, right?
Big time.
So like either it's a bomb of a serve coming at you, which is not comfortable.
No.
Or it's an error, and then you don't get any comfort out of it.
Any reps out of it. Yeah. And we just kind of said, okay. And then that was the thing. It's like the whole team reacted the same way to that error. I was just like, okay, we just go back and we just side out, and then the next person's going to take a rip, and they're going to have a good chance. And so we had a lot of guys hitting.
So there must have been
serves.
also some games where, you just gave away a ton of points just in the flow of the match, right?
Oh, completely. Yeah.
It just wasn't our night, or just,
Like we lost the Canada West Conference semifinal. We were the higher seed. We were playing at home against U of A, and we lost, I think, both nights.
Yeah.
I'm really bad. I'm not that coach that can memorize every game, but I'm pretty sure we lost both nights, I think, in 4 or 5 sets at home. So we didn't go to the Canada West finals. So then we had to play the Canada West bronze medal match to make it to nationals. And so U of A went to the finals against Trinity Western. Yeah. And then so we had to win the bronze medal match. So that weekend, I think we missed almost 40% of our serves, and we lost. The next weekend, we had to play the bronze medal match against Manitoba. And if memory serves me right, we missed like 18% of our serves, and we crushed them. Right. In the same gym. Yeah. We were at home again, and so like we were on, we're off. Like that's how it was going to be. And for the most part, there's kind of like you're going to normalize over time to a certain amount. Yeah. And and I truly believe that was still our best opportunity to try and win. Yeah. So we kept it rolling, and then at the nationals, we won the national final in 3 straight sets. Yeah. And our serving was good, but it wasn't exceptional. Yeah. Like it was probably about our average on the year. Right. But that average was better than everybody else. That average was good enough to win. Yeah.
Amazing. So now to the current moment.
Sure.
So what is your role now at Volleyball Canada?
Yes, I'm the high performance manager for our national beach volleyball program. Yeah. So I oversee kind of the hiring and positioning of all of our staff around we have our senior teams, kind of our Olympic beach volleyball teams. Yep. And then we have kind of a next gen kind of development group below that. Yeah. So I work through the pathway and through that pipeline, trying to get people to the Olympics, and then oversee those teams that are at the top as well. And obviously a big focus on those teams, and a high proportion of our total funding and time and energy and effort goes into trying to win medals at Olympic Games.
And are you responsible for the selection of those teams in the first place too, or is that kind of set in place as to how that works?
Yeah, it's really interesting how it works. In beach volleyball, we select at the next gen level. Yeah. So we select people in to train. They then acquire senior status based on performance results. Okay. So if you get a certain number of podium performances or top 5 or top 10 performances at different levels, then what we have is you then graduate out of our next gen pool into the senior pool. Yeah. So the senior pool is you get carding money, which is a Sport Canada thing in Canada where it's a monthly stipend. So it elevates as you go from next gen to senior, it goes up in dollar amounts. And then we as Volleyball Canada also invest more money in those teams that are at that senior level. Yeah. And then we work with them on kind of building out their team. So who's their coach and the staff around them. Because that's one thing that I would say, coming predominantly from an indoor background versus a beach volleyball background, when you shrink the team size down, the interpersonal relationships just become that much more important. Mm. So for us to come and say, like, we don't pick who the teams play, who the partners are, who they play with. So
even at the next gen level,
even at the next gen level, they get to pick the partner.
They figure it out.
They got to pick, and like right now we're starting kind of year one of our next quadrennial building towards LA 2028.
Yeah,
and we're encouraging them to try different partners. Like you guys are 4 years away from going to the Olympics.
Yeah,
try different partners, different competitions, what have you, and try and figure out what fits. And so at the senior level, same idea. Those same athletes are picking their partnerships, but they're also heavily involved in coaching selection as well.
When do you think they really have to lock in with their partners? Like 2 years prior or 18 months or something like that?
Like our team that just had its top performance in Paris this summer, they locked in not quite 2 years out.
Okay.
I don't know if there was a single team at the Olympics that was later than that.
Okay.
Most actually were probably almost the whole quadrennial together.
Right.
From Tokyo in.
Do other countries do it the same way where they kind of give agency to the players in selecting partnerships, or are there other countries where it's like, no, you two are playing together and
there's a lot of variability.
Okay.
Yeah, this is something that's been really fascinating for me is looking at the different models and how much they vary.
Yeah.
You know, there's some countries that are like, we are only going to fund you if you play with you and that's your coach.
Right.
And there's no agency whatsoever.
Yeah.
And it's either you're in or you're out. You know, and then there's others like the United States. I'll just use them as an example. Mm-hmm. Our neighbors to the south, the teams pick themselves, and then they get like monthly stipends based on how well they're performing. Yeah. And those stipends allow them to. They go and hire their coach. They definitely choose what tournaments they play in,
right.
and they get stipends kind of based on performance. And if you're doing well, you keep getting money. And if you fall off the performance and you're not getting those results, then USA Volleyball dials the money back.
Right.
Yeah, so there's kind of I would say the two ends of the spectrum on that.
And are you kind of re-looking at how things are going to work for LA or?
Yeah, we're in our process right now of kind of what we call our quadrennial debrief. Mm-hmm. So we're going through this fall, working on looking at that. So looking at how did it go this quad? Mm-hmm. And it's funny, call it a quad because of COVID. It's actually only been 3 years since Tokyo. So, right. So a pretty quick kind of like sprint to Paris. But what did go well? What are our learnings even in the 5 years we had leading up to Tokyo? We did a big debrief then. We've tried to change a few things, but how do we need to continue to change moving forward?
Yep.
So that's, continuing to look at that. And a lot of it comes down to what model works also depends on what are your financial resources.
Sure.
How much money do you have to invest? And, you know, in sport in Canada and Olympic sport in Canada it's tight financially. There's not a ton of
and rewards winners, right? Like doubles down on winners.
Yeah, exactly. And you can, like our biggest funding kind of pool at the high performance level comes from this group called Own the Podium, mm-hmm. and government funded. And to get identified for Own the Podium, you need to show podium potential.
Right.
And so there's a component of like you got to get yourself there on your own bootstraps.
Yeah.
You know, and then once you get there, you get rewarded, and then you continue to keep getting funding, and the amount of funding you get depends on how many teams or athletes you have that show medal potential at the forthcoming games.
Right.
And you got to prove that you have medal potential.
And then, so how much of a difference going into LA is it that the Brandie and Melissa won?
Yeah,
one silver.
Yeah, it's to be determined.
Okay.
You know, because there's a component where going into Paris, there was a time where we had two teams that were probably in the top 5 in the world. And we were making strong cases that we had 2 podium potential teams.
Right.
You know, right now we have Melissa and Brandie going into LA for sure being the one. And then there's more of uncertainty around, you know, retirements and partnerships and what have you.
And they've already committed they want to play in LA.
Yeah, they've committed through to LA at this point. So they're going to go to LA. Funny enough, they live and train in LA. So in a weird way, they're a Canadian team, but it's home games for them in LA. So so they're going to make that push, and they've committed to that. And then, so we know we have one podium team, and they're a proven podium team now that they have a silver medal, which is great. But independently, Melissa had won world championships, and Brandie had a silver medal world championships. So we knew that, like, kind of on paper, it could be there. So so we're uncertain. We submit to Own the Podium kind of our proposal here early November, and then we'll find out February next year what that funding looks like and how much it changes from what we had going into Paris. And
out of those next gen athletes, that layer, how many are converted indoor players?
Almost all of them would be at least like high school 18U club level players.
Okay.
There's almost no one that's not coming from indoor in some capacity.
Yeah.
So they would be playing, but the amount that have, say, gone on, and I'd say, secondly, the vast majority have gone on to play college and university. On the boys' side, it's all indoor.
Yeah.
On the girls' side, with the development of beach volleyball in the NCAA, now most of our female athletes are actually going through the NCAA system and then coming to us.
Yeah.
Yeah, and that's been an evolution with the growth and expansion of beach volleyball in the NCAA for the women's side.
Got it. Okay. And then I guess, well, you're going to determine this over the next little while, but who gets into that next gen layer could be different based on, just how teams were performing at this level at this point, forecasting out what other countries are going to be doing for LA. Do we need bigger teams? Do we need, how do we match up players, et cetera, right?
Yeah, and like style of play is another factor. Like the traditional, I'll use the men's game as an example. The traditional beach volleyball team has a 6'10" blocker, and a 5'10" to 6'2" defender that's really fast, and that's been the traditional style of play that's dominated beach volleyball. And then this year we saw the Swedish team won the gold medal in 2 straight blowout in the finals. They had some rockiness along the way, but those are 2 like 6'4", 6'5" guys,
right?
That are much more kind of similar in size, but their skill level is amazing,
right?
And they're playing a different style of game. They're hitting the ball on the second contact a lot more often.
I think that's probably the most striking stylistic thing that's changed.
Yeah, they're jump setting balls and they're jumping as if they're about to hit, and then they'll set to the other person. Yeah. And in beach volleyball, you only have one blocker that can't block 2 people at the same time. And so they have really, they've been doing this for an entire since Tokyo. Yeah. And but they've really perfected their craft, and now everyone's trying to copy. And that's like they've put themselves at the top and really innovated the sport. And so now we're looking at, specifically on the men's side, the athletes coming up. Do we need to have athletes that can play that style? Versus the 6'10", 6'11" big blocker and smaller defender.
In theory, that style you should be able to replicate it.
You should be able to replicate it, but it requires a very high level of skill.
Yeah.
And so it always comes down to, with any team, there's this model that seems like this beautiful way of playing, but if you don't have those horses, if you don't have the people that have that ability, you got to figure out how do you get the most out of the cards you're dealt. Yeah. And so we got to look at because I would say in Canada, we are not a high skill country. Yeah. We take a very long time in the sport of volleyball to really close the gap on the rest of the world. And so
is that changing, or have you not seen evidence yet?
I wouldn't say we've seen dramatic shifts in this. Okay. There's a lot of effort going in to make that different and to change that. And like Volleyball Canada's investing in, high school age kids now on the indoor side with what they call the National Excellence Programs. You have grade 10s and 11s and 12s that are giving up 4 months of their school year and relocating to the National Team Training Center and training in a full-time capacity to try and close that skill gap. So they're not playing on their high school volleyball team. They're playing with the national team for those months, and then they come back and they play their club volleyball as normal. So we're seeing that, and like there's growth in that space to try and close those skill gaps. But it's just a different environment as well. Like our athletes finish, club volleyball at 18, and then almost all of them are going to university. Mm-hmm. And we are that's how our system works. And we go to university and we play volleyball at a university level. Whereas the average kid in Germany or France or Poland goes to a professional volleyball club. Yep. And all they do now is play volleyball. Yeah. It's their full-time job. Whereas we do it on the side of being a student. And there's a developmental gap there that just develops over 4 or 5 years of a university career. We can't replicate that European model. So then when they finish university, we have to keep working to try and keep closing that gap.
Do you think there are enough hours in the day to replicate it? It's probably not that far off, right? Because even if you're a club team there, you're only training once a day, maximum 2.
Maximum 2 a day. I think it's possible. I think part of it is that the level that they're training at is just because they're training and with 28, 32, 34-year-olds. Yeah. as 18-year-olds.
Yeah.
You know, so the level, it's a higher level. The hours can be there.
Yeah.
But if we look at like a lot of like college, university players, like most after they play on the weekends, they take the Monday off, they take Sunday off, they take the Monday off, you know, and then they get back to training on kind of Tuesday and they'll go through till Saturday.
Yeah.
You know, and so most aren't doing double days. You know, that doesn't really exist. Most don't have dedicated strength and conditioning, you know, at a high level, you know, and the stress and demands of the academic load that they have does detract a little bit from it. But I don't think we are that far off. I think we can be pretty close. But the problem is we don't have the level's not quite as high.
Yeah, which would always be difficult because, you know, I think you're really hitting your prime by 27, 28. Yeah. Whereas here you're
graduated
gone,
at 23.
Like at 23, you're just getting there.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. So the level is just we can't replicate the level, unfortunately.
What are your current views on specialization in youth sport?
Yeah, it's a good one.
Because we're just talking about, like, if we want to close the gap, like this is what other countries are doing. This is what we need to do by like grade 10, grade 11, grade 12. These athletes need to be training at a really super high level. Especially, where are your views right now?
It's really interesting.
Now that we've got like Range sitting here at the top.
That's a great one.
Yeah.
It's really interesting because if we look at the top countries that are really like skill-wise or really, really high, they're specializing young. Like that is the reality of what they're doing. They're not really diversified in their sport. You know, we talk about taking grade 10, 11, and 12s into a national team training center. You know, the Italians are doing that at 14. You know, like they're doing it 2 years earlier than us, and they're doing it year round.
Yeah.
You know, with 100 kids versus our 20 or something.
Yeah.
You know, like, so they're specializing even earlier than we are.
Yeah.
That said, we're able to close the gap eventually. You know, we need more runway to eventually get to that point. And I am a firm believer that if we look at our top athletes still that are doing really well on our Olympic teams with our men and on our top senior women's team on indoor, and even for the most part, those of our beach athletes that are playing at that level, almost all of them are playing multiple sports up until 18 at a pretty competitive level. You know, almost all of them were soccer players or basketball players or hockey players or baseball players.
Yeah.
You know, so they have diversification in their sport experience. And most of the data would say that they're not actually choosing volleyball as like all they're going to do until they're 17 and 18 years of age.
Right.
And from a physiological development perspective, you can't really argue that that's not a better system than like the mono training of just volleyball, just jumping, doing the same thing, just from a repetitive, you know, load perspective, as well as just like the dynamic ability to learn new skills, you know, and learn new movement patterns and just understand how our body works in space. Yeah. You know, so the ability to do multiple sport, I'm a huge fan of. Yeah. And exposing our young athletes to multiple sports, I think, is really, really important.
So it's probably still some combination of both, where like at the highest levels we have to do better in like the grade 9, 10 like ages, where like they're playing at super high levels still. Yeah. Potentially they have a rough idea of like, okay, this is probably my main sport, but I need to do this other stuff too, or it's healthy to do this other stuff.
Yeah, and part of it is also just like when we are doing volleyball, are we really doing it well? You know, and so there's a large component of just like having strong coaches, you know, that know what they're doing and are exposing the athletes, you know, setting up the environment that's going to optimize learning of volleyball when they do have those volleyball moments. Yeah. You know, and that's a big component of it as well. Yeah. You know, so the work that we do in coach education, you know, is also just as important. And then having them leave volleyball and go and do soccer and do all those sports is great. But when we're doing volleyball, to do it well. And I don't want to knock our high school kind of volleyball system. But for the most part, in high school volleyball, we have teachers that coach the teams, and their knowledge and understanding of volleyball is often at a much lower level than what you'll see in, say, club volleyball. Where the coaches that are doing it in a community level at a club system, they're pretty passionate about volleyball. That is their number one sport, and they've probably played it, and they've done their coaching certification levels, and so there's a higher level of development that happens there. So that's one of the reasons why that National Excellence Program targets the high school season and takes them out of that environment, because that's an environment where we just don't feel that there's a lot of volleyball development happening, even though they're doing volleyball hours. Like high school teams often play way more games. They play multiple times a week in league, and then they have tournaments on the weekends. Like they play and play and play and play a ton, but there's not a lot of development happening within that time frame.
Going back to Paris.
Do
you think there will ever be a better venue than the base of the Eiffel Tower?
I don't know if we had this conversation in Paris with a colleague of mine, and we were trying to go around the world and pick landmarks. Conceptualize a landmark that you could build a beach volleyball venue under, or around, or what have you. We're like the Colosseum in Rome, or there's but it was a small list.
What actually has a little bit of the land around it? It's it's not a lot.
Not a lot, and it's funny because our World Championships were in Mexico, and in Mexico, World Championships were all in bullfighting arenas. These bullfighting rings, all the venue. There's 4 of them. And it was really, really cool. And just such a cool kind of environment for it. And I just remember being in awe of being in these bullfighting rings, and just thought it was the coolest thing. And then sitting under the Eiffel Tower and being like, all right, you won up to World Championships. This is pretty spectacular.
Okay, so how many weeks were you actually in Paris? You were
I was there about just over 3 weeks.
Okay.
Yeah, with our team. So
a
long time. We came in about 7 to 8 days before the start of the games, kind of acclimatization, training, what have you, kind of get settled into everything.
And training at the Eiffel Tower, right?
Training at the Eiffel Tower. We had a second training site as well, off-site, that was a bit closer to the village, because transportation from the Olympic Village to the Eiffel Tower was a challenge. Security was really high. We obviously had to cross over the river, and bridges were getting closed for the opening ceremonies that floated down the river. And so we had a lot of transportation was definitely our biggest challenge.
It was an hour commute or something? Or?
Some of them were, we had some that were as much as 90 to 100 minutes on the bus. And some of the buses weren't air conditioned. Early in the games, they weren't allowing us to open the windows on the buses because of security concerns. They were afraid that someone might drop a bomb in a bus or something of that nature. So all the windows had to be closed up, and they would tape them as we left the village. And then if any piece of tape broke or whatever, when we got to the venue, everyone had to get off and go through metal detectors, and security would be super high because we would breach the bubble-to-bubble concept that they try and maintain at the games. And so, it was definitely we had our challenges, but for the most part, however, we did train at the Eiffel Tower on the training courts there, which were even closer to the tower than where the competition venue was.
So what did a typical day look like in week 1 of the games?
Before the competition started?
No,
during competition.
During competition,
Yeah, so during competition, the Olympics, it's just such a unique environment for us. We're so used to playing 1 to 2 matches a day, and we play over 3-4 days. So we're used to kind of coming in and condensed schedule, blast through it. You basically just play, break, what have you.
Yeah, because the matches aren't that long.
We're an hour long matches for the most part. Can maybe go to an hour and 15. So we're pretty short. So we can play multiples in a day. So that's what we're used to. And then we get to the Olympics, and we had teams with 4 days between games. And so as Canada, we had 3 teams there. We had 2 women's teams and 1 men's team. And for the most part, we had I think a team playing every single day. And almost never did we actually have multiple teams playing in one day. So for each team, for the most part, if they play that day, if it's a later night match, they'll kind of do a morning light practice sort of idea. And then if they don't play that day, then they definitely have a training session that day. And often they will actually set up training sessions with other countries so that they can scrimmage. Because they're allowed to book kind of a certain time period, but then if another team joins them, they get to double their time period that they can book for. So for the most part, that was kind of our structure. So we would have teams practicing on sand kind of as early as like 9 in the morning. They'd be on sand.
Yeah.
And then we had games starting as late as 11 p.m. at night, going till midnight. So yeah, every day was a little bit variable depending on the schedule of.
So for the most part, you're getting there early, staying there till late. And
yeah, so for the most part, I would be up and go with the first team to the first training session of that day.
Yeah.
And then usually sticking around the venue as other teams would come and train or what have you.
Working with their coaches, working with their
working with
sponsors.
Not so much sponsors. We actually have another sponsors are out of the venue, and we have another person that kind of manages the sponsors.
Yeah.
The biggest one is we have training partners.
Yeah.
So we brought along 4 guys. And then they could essentially be a shadow team for us to play against.
Yeah.
So if we knew we were playing against a certain team and we wanted to replicate that style, what have you, we had 4 of our next-gen players that could then work as kind of a shadow team.
Cool.
So managing kind of those guys and making sure they knew what their roles and responsibilities were kind of for that day was one part. Managing kind of logistics around travel, food. Like they're often at the venue for long times. We have to pre-order food to get food to them at the venue so they can be fueled. We do a lot around heat mitigation.
Yeah.
So working with our physiologist around kind of our ice vests, having those ready and frozen, and then around like ice slurries, a lot of like that we drink to try and manage heat mitigation as another component. And then kind of just logistics, of those pieces, media requirements.
Yeah.
Managing that kind of thing. So I would just kind of set up shop for the most part at the venue, and teams would come and go, and I would send about 500 WhatsApp messages a day between everybody and just live on my phone communicating for the most part via WhatsApp.
And then gradually, I guess, as we get into week 2, it's just more focusing on the teams that are still in it.
That are still in it. Yeah, as teams start to get eliminated, they have a stay-and-play policy. So the athletes, this is Olympic-wide, so athletes must leave the venue within 72 hours of being eliminated from the games. Staff that are associated with that team have to leave within 48 hours.
Yeah.
So a team gets eliminated and you're immediately like booking flights, or if they want to stay in Paris, they got to go find a hotel or find a place to stay. So there's that, but then on the flip side, there's still the team that are in the tournament and trying to kind of hyper-focus on them. But the job gets easier as you kind of whittle down. But then media gets bigger, pressure gets bigger. I got COVID at that point, so I had to kind of do my job from my room in the village for a few days, kind of isolated myself for a couple of days just to make sure we didn't spread anything amongst our team. And then COVID was very rampant around the games.
Oh, I bet.
Yeah.
What was the vibe like at the village?
So interesting. So
because based on this like bubble to bubble approach, if you're an athlete in competition and not doing something on that, like in competition that day, you're probably just hanging out there, right?
Yeah, there's definitely there is that. A lot of other, we're kind of a unique sport that we start on opening day and we play on last day.
Yeah.
There's kind of actually like 2 waves that happens. Like the huge population goes from swimming to athletics.
Yeah.
Swimmers start the games and they kind of go the first half, and then swimming ends and athletics takes over and athletics goes to second half. So in the village, you kind of have this like changeover. Yeah. Of like the swimmers are out in the
vibe shift.
And this vibe shift of like from swimmers to athletics, so that kind of changes. Whereas a lot of the teams, and then, rugby came in and blasted through in the first 5 days, and then rugby's gone. And so you have different sports that kind of like pop up for short periods, but you don't have a whole lot that are like us kind of staying the whole time.
Yeah.
So we came in 8 days before. Not a lot were there that early. We were kind of on like the first day we could get in.
Yeah.
So kind of as we build up to opening ceremonies, the village is just building.
Yeah.
Every day it's just getting a little bit busier. The food hall is lineups are getting longer. It's getting louder.
Yeah.
More people cruising around. So you kind of have this like massive kind of growth as you get to the games. In the midpoint, you have that switch over of swimming and athletics, and all of a sudden it's just like different personnel are around. And then what gets really interesting, I thought, was as we got towards the end of the games, and it just got so quiet. The last couple of days, like leading into into our finals and leading into the closing ceremonies, it felt like the village was dead. Like I'm walking into the food hall and like walking up, no lines to get anything. And, I'm just like, this place is a ghost town.
Yeah.
As it really, really winds down near the end.
Was there anything that you saw at the village that like caused you to double take? Like, I can't believe this athlete's doing this, or?
There's a few things that kind of, it's funny. Some of the African nations and just the vibe that they brought to the village was so cool. Like they would almost like Congo line from the bus transport to like their building with like
amazing.
a stereo.
Yeah.
And they'd have someone be rolling this stereo, playing like African drum music. And then there's like a Congo line and then people are like joining into it as they're just like, heading up to their building. Like I remember the Ivory Coast group, doing that. I'm just like, it was just like such cool vibes.
Yeah.
So that one really sticks with me. And then just seeing some of these like incredible athletes, like some of the marathon runners running laps around the village.
Right.
And just being like, I can't believe, and like some of the celebrities that you see and the athletes that you see, it's really like, I can't believe that person's that tall or that person's that short or, like you see the faces, but to see them in person, is interesting. And then I think probably another interesting one is there's a communal weight room in the village. So some of the countries like USA, they have their own weight room that they build into the Team USA house. And then Canada, we have our own smaller one, but we have ours. I'm sure Australia had one, I know for sure. And I'm sure some other countries did. But there's a lot of countries that don't have their own in there. So then they're using the communal one. So you go into this weight room and it's huge. There's probably, I don't know, I'm going to say 40 squat racks along the one wall.
Okay, yeah.
But you could have like a gymnast squatting on one squat rack with an Olympic weightlifter on the next, and it's like all incredible athletes.
All the shapes
but
and
like
sizes.
all the shapes and sizes and like weights and like, and activities of what everyone's doing. And so going into that weight room and just like working out in there was such a cool experience and just seeing the diversity, within that environment.
How were athletes eating in the village? Like poorly?
I think they got, I wasn't really following it, so I was hearing bits and pieces from what was getting exposed to the media. But in the first, I would say like week of being in the village, the food was subpar.
Okay.
They were frequently running out of stuff, predominantly protein.
Yeah.
Just didn't have enough protein.
Yeah.
I heard rumors that they ended up bringing in a group from like England to take over like the lead of the catering and whatnot. They were talking about, there was just supply chain issues and why they couldn't get it and whatnot. So I would say it started off pretty rough, but it got a lot better. I know everyone's different. Like one of the things, actually, I think it got international acclaim is these chocolate muffins.
Okay.
So there's these chocolate muffins that had like a ball of fudge in the middle.
Okay.
This massive ball of fudge, and everyone kind of talked about it. And it would be interesting to like be walking around. You could see these things. There's no way there's anything healthy about these muffins.
Yeah.
And you'd see the athletes that are just like, I don't care. Like they're devouring these muffins. There's dessert with every single meal, and there's those that are going for it and having it. And our athletes are very good and very professional and really stick to kind of to their dietary plan or whatever. So no concerns on our end. Our coaches were definitely indulging in some muffins, but
Is it possible in 2024 to win an Olympic medal and still smoke cigarettes?
I discovered that it was. Yeah, there's definitely some that were still smoking. It's interesting. Like there's still those cultures that's still part of their culture in some way, shape, or form, and it still blows my mind that's the case.
Like still in the village,
still in the village. Yeah, saw an athlete. Yeah, just sitting having his espresso and his cigarette, and then going and playing a gold medal game and winning. And so it is possible.
Amazing. Have you got to the point now where you feel like we won a silver and didn't lose a gold?
Yeah, good question. I have. I've got there. I mean, it's probably was easier because we didn't have a great, Mel and Brandie didn't have a great start to the games. We ended up finishing third in our pool, which was, we were the number one seed in our pool. Really expected to not easily, but expected to win our pool. So I think there was a component of, appreciation that our tournament didn't end sooner. We had to go through a lucky loser, round of 16, quarterfinals, and so I think because of that, I think there's also it's easier to accept that a silver medal is still pretty darn good.
Yeah.
It probably took about 72 hours before I got to that point, though. and mainly I'm just sad for them.
Yeah.
That we had a big lead in the first set against Brazil. I think, and if we replayed that set over again with that lead, we would win it 9 times out of 10. And then we dominated the second set and won that one comfortably. And then Brazil played a great third. And we lost that one. But still super proud, and I'm there now.
Now that we've been away from it for a couple weeks, what are the kind of 2 or 3 things that stand out when you think of the games?
Oh man, good question. I didn't appreciate, I think, how emotionally taxing the games were, even on myself. Like, I found myself coming back and, like, not someone that I would say ever really feels burnout. Always super high energy. I'm good to go. And I came back. I was wiped. Like, we were going to go on a little family trip, being away for a long time. And I just had to repack a suitcase. I had to unpack my Paris suitcase, and I had to repack a new suitcase to go with my family, and just turn in my wife and just being like, I don't think I can pack right now. Like, I don't have the headspace or the energy or the emotion. It wasn't jet lag. It was nothing. It was just like, just motivation. I'm like, I think I'm just like emotionally, like, that was such a roller coaster.
Yeah.
The games are just such a roller, like from the opening ceremonies highs to losing match lows to, obviously playing in a finals and thinking you're going to win and then losing the finals. So just going on this emotional roller coaster and how taxing that really was certainly one of my big kind of takeaways, and recognizing that, everyone needs space, I think, after to really decompress, because it's a lot to take on.
And then, what about a couple memories that were just like, you'll think of the games and be like, this particular moment, or
oh man, there's
just think of some lights in the Eiffel Tower, or
the opening ceremonies was incredible. Floating down the river and kind of seeing it. I've still been meaning to go back and watch, like, the production of it, because our experience on a boat, I think, was totally different than what the viewer at home was getting.
Sure,
but that experience and kind of the hype and the energy and the excitement around it was something that I'll always remember. And walking out under the Eiffel Tower in the opening ceremonies, and there was lots of rumors that, Celine Dion was going to be performing. And as the Canadian team, there's a lot of excitement around that. So when that ended up, coming to fruition right at the end, there was huge amounts of excitement amongst Team Canada.
Yeah.
So those memories, I'd say opening and closing ceremonies are 2, real distinct ones that really stand out for me.
Yeah.
Cool.
So we had the opportunity to sit down and watch the men's indoor final, which was outrageous. It was incredible. Even though it was just still a 3-0 match.
Yeah.
And when being there up and close and having played at a pretty high level before, this was like a sport that's like somewhat unrecognizable.
Yeah.
In a lot of ways, where the level of play is just so high. It seems like it's gotten quite a bit higher in the past decade. Do you think we're at a bit of a plateau now, or do you think there's like actually another frontier for the game, both on the women and men's side? Specifically on the indoor side. We talked a little bit about beach, and there's like some stuff tactically happening. Yeah. Do you think there's another level to hit there? So what is it?
Yeah, it's interesting. I think physically, it's hard to imagine it getting much higher. Like the physicality of the athletes today and how good they are. Yeah. It's hard to imagine that they're going to jump higher and hit harder. But history would prove me wrong.
Yeah.
So I'm guessing it's going to continue to keep climbing.
Yeah.
And maybe there's a bit of maybe it will plateau a little bit more. But there was big athletes doing a lot of these things probably 12 years ago that, I didn't get to see as much in person as this time around.
Yeah.
But I think
there's just more of them now too.
There's just more of them.
At that time, there's like 2 or 3, and now there's like 10 to 12 that are.
Yeah. And I think there's 18-year-old kids that are coming up that are looking like that.
Yeah.
So that's definitely changing. I do still think that there's some tactical evolutions to the sport that I think are still to come.
Okay.
Like we've seen specific on the men's side where there's a back row attacker will will take if the setter digs the ball, then they'll come out of the back row and jump as if they're going to hit it, and then they can set out of it. So we're seeing kind of that evolution, but I think there's still more layers and kind of configurations of how that could work.
Yeah.
Some different options of, instead of putting it to that person, what if you put it to the front row power hitter?
Yeah.
Why don't they do the same thing from being in the front court?
Sure.
And then they could set over to the opposite.
Yeah, I guess as we were talking about before the start of the conversation around just the first contact coming off of basically an easy ball.
Yeah.
You can play around with that.
You could play around with that.
Yeah.
So I think there's still some some creativeness that is still available. And I think that is, I think France's success with playing, I would say right now they would be a very highly creative team.
Yeah.
I would say Japan's probably up there as well. That's really kind of pushing the needle in that regard.
Yeah.
And I think the success that's having is also going to make other more traditional volleyball countries that don't play with that creativity, that rely purely on physicality.
Yeah.
To really reevaluate how they perform. So
Yeah.
I do think that there's a creativity evolution that's still to come. And we're saying this on the men's side, but I think the exact same thing applies to the women's side as well.
Right.
I think that that creativity component is still there.
When do you think we'll see a medal for indoor volleyball for Canada? Are you optimistic about this?
It's interesting. I don't want to say I'm not optimistic. I think it's certainly possible.
Yeah.
There's a possibility there. It's really, really hard. I think as being a non-traditional volleyball country.
Yeah.
And I think this is the same in any team sport. You pick your team sport, and if your country doesn't consider that sport to be part of their tradition, I think you have a real uphill battle to try and get to a point where you're going to
get mind share, get funding, all of it.
All of it. And so we
Although it would seem that it's turning over on the women's side, right? Where this is one of the preeminent.
Yeah, it's one of the fastest growing sports, proportionally
solidly number 3 behind basketball and soccer.
And I think maybe 2 over basketball.
Right.
I think it's right there with basketball. I don't know the exact numbers, but I think it's really close. Soccer would still be the preeminent team sport in Canada. And that's what I mean. You look at we do well in women's soccer.
Yeah.
It is the female sport. We do well in men's hockey. It is the male.
We can't forget women's hockey too, but still,
and women's hockey as well. Yes,
yeah.
And we do well in the winter sport and women's hockey as well, for sure. But I think there's until I think, and if we look at the teams in France, volleyball it's a big deal. On the men's side.
Yeah.
It's a pretty big deal there. It's less of a big deal on the women's side in France.
Right.
And we don't see that same level of success on the women's side at the international level indoor. So I do think there's a component of that, but it doesn't mean it's not possible.
Yeah.
There's certainly teams that it's not part of their culture, and they do really well because their development structure is really, really solid.
Yeah.
And I think we saw that soccer's always been relatively popular in the women's game in Canada.
Yeah.
Why did we go from not having, that much success to winning a gold medal? I think Soccer Canada and John Herdman and the work that he did created a structure and a pipeline, and a system that permitted them to be able to get a team, and put a team together that could compete at that level.
Yeah.
Because ultimately, for us in volleyball, we need to make sure we need 7 players.
Yes. And in the past, we've had, I would probably 3 to 4, maximum 5 of world class at every single position, but haven't had that year yet where 7 across the board were top tier.
Exactly. Yeah. And that's what you need to get to. You need to be able to have 7. And usually to have 7, you probably need 12.
Right. Which, as we saw with Poland, they're bringing on bench players that are
superstars in their leagues.
Yeah.
Yeah. That can come in and just change
matches and be
completely.
Yeah.
Yeah. So you have those teams that have that ability, and, it's USA basketball, same idea, so to be a preeminent world power and a consistent world power, you do have to have that depth.
Yeah.
Otherwise you might flash pan and you might have hey, we finally got it, but then they age out, they get old, whatever, they get injured, and then you fall so fast.
Yeah.
So I think that's one of the key pieces, that we're trying to look at is how do you create sustainable success?
Yep. Kerry MacDonald, this is great.
It's been lots of fun. I appreciate having
Thanks for taking the time.
Anytime.
Thank you for joining us for this episode of Energy Untold. Energy Untold is produced by Shortline Creative and recorded at GBE Energy. Art is curated with the assistance of Norberg Hall. For more information on the show, visit energyuntold.com. We would love your feedback. Send us a message at hello@energyuntold.com. Thank you again, and until next time, I am Corey Paddock.